Those at the back started talking, and one remarked that was sharpshooting. It was a headshot after headshot. The other guy asked, "And where did those bodyguards come from?" I realized murder had taken place. The officer told me, "Some secrets you don't tell anyone. You die with them."
Who was that?
Matiang'i's personal assistant. I am Maurice Njuguna, and I was a taxi driver between 2015 and 2016.
2015, 2016.
When I look around, it's not what I expected. How did you get here?
I was a taxi driver, and one day a client called me, and when he got into the taxi, he told me he wanted me to take him to Kikuyu, where his friend was stranded. When we got at a place called N, around Kabete police station, he got out a pistol and he told me not to worry about what was going on. Past Kabete, he communicated with the guy we were going to pick, and he told him to call him when we got to Gitaru. When we got to Gitaru, the guy told us not to go into Kikuyu. What time was it? It was 4 a.m. He called him and we were directed to move towards Limuru Road instead of Kikuyu. And he told us to wait for him at a place called Ekatano. While waiting, I saw a guy who was wearing a hoodie and a balaclava, so I didn't see his face clearly even when he got into the car. I thought we were just picking up that guy and going back, but he told me to continue on that road so we would pick up someone else. The new guy made a call and asked one on the other side of the call if they had tied those people well and wiped everything. I started wondering what was going on. I was tensed, so I told them I was going home, so I had not fueled the car, and they told me there was no problem, I could go into the next petrol station. That trick failed to work, and when we got into the petrol station, he asked me to stop at the roadside. He removed the balaclava and was left with a hoodie. The first client was seated on the front seat and they changed with the guy we had picked up. The client had asked for my phone after exhausting his airtime, so the last call he had made with my phone. After exchanging seats, now we got into the petrol station and he called the watchman. He gave him 50 shillings, then asked him to call the petrol attendant who filled my tank. He didn't even pay for the fuel. He told me they would pay me all the money. So I paid, and as I was getting into Naivasha Road, he directed me to take a rough road. Going down the rough road, he made a call to the other guys and asked them to start moving. We moved for a while, and about 2 kilometers, 2 people on the roadside raised their hands and he told me those were the guys. So I turned back the car, but after stopping, they did not get into the car immediately. They went back into the bushes.
All of them?
No, just the 2 guys that were outside. They came back with bags.
How big were the bags?
One was like a golf bag. Then there were 2 briefcases, which they had placed at the back and gave the golf bag to the guy seated in the front seat. The other 2 guys got in and he told me to drive. When I looked at the bag, I saw something like an AK-47 muzzle protruding.
The golf bag?
Yes, when I saw the muzzle, I knew that was a gun. I was so tense, and I told them the car wasn't mine, so I had to drive slowly until we got to the highway. I had to be cooperative. They didn't ask you anything? No, they just wanted me to drive. So after getting into the highway, I drove up to Kino, where they told me to branch towards a place called Kiruga. I drove towards Kiruga for about half a kilometer and then branched into a small street and stopped after about 100 meters. After stopping, the guy seated at the front seat got out with a golf bag and he asked for 1 briefcase from the back, and then he told me to go ahead and turn the car around. I turned, and while we were waiting for the guy, those at the back started talking, and one remarked that those were smart, straight headshots. The other guy asked, where did those bodyguards come from? I realized murders had taken place.
You did not ask them what they were talking about?
No, I didn't want to know. Or it was because of the tension that they were speaking freely, so they said no one had been left alive. The guy came back. He had changed into a tracksuit and he did not have the bag with him. He was changed and he was jovial, and he told me to drive as I do with my customers. I started driving towards Kangemi, and before we got to Mountain View, the guy said to me, "Anything that you have seen or heard in this car should never get out. And if it does, I will kill you within 2 days." That's what he said to me.
As a warning? Yeah.
"I will kill you in less than 2 days." I told him I had not seen or heard anything. When we got to Mountain View, he and one other guy got out, and I was left with the client who had called me and the other guy. I drove those two and left them at Kangemi. I asked him about money, and he said he had my number and he would send me the money. So I went back and parked the car at the stage in Kangemi. But before I parked the car at Kangemi,
It was around what time?
it was around 5 to 5:30 in the morning. Before leaving the taxi for the day operator, I decided to search the car just to ensure they had not dropped anything there. I found a particular metal that they had dropped. It had a bad smell, so I folded it using a piece of tissue paper and kept it because it seemed important.
You said it smelled awful.
Very much. I kept it away, parked the car, and went home. On the way home, I was caught in traffic at Chiromo, and people were wondering how was there traffic, yet it was very early in the morning. The driver of the matatu had boarded asked another one who was coming from town center, and he told him that there had been a shootout in town, so some roads had been closed. Now, even before I had forgotten the things I had witnessed, I'm getting information about another shootout where people had died. I decided to just go home. I got to town and went home, along Thika Road. It was around 7 in the morning, and even though I tried, I could not sleep. I told my wife that the people I had carried were not good people and they were from killing some people. She asked me what I had done, and I told her I had done nothing because I had no evidence. But those guys had guns and they had tied up some people somewhere. So she told me to try and get some sleep and would figure out what to do later. At around 8 a.m., she got up and turned on the TV. There was breaking news about an MP who had been killed. She woke me up and I saw that an MP, his bodyguards, and driver had been killed. You remembered? I recalled those guys talking about bodyguards. Things started to add up in my mind. Those were talking about 4 murdered people by being shot on the heads.
Things were adding up.
Yes, it just added up. I asked her what to do, and she told me to remain calm because I didn't know anything yet. At around 2 in the afternoon, the guy called me and told me that there is a metal they had left in the car, and I told him I didn't get it because I had not searched the car, so I would check in the evening. He told me to tell him in the evening if they had left it in the car or they had lost it somewhere else. In the evening, I went to work.
You did not check that metallic piece?
I didn't want to know its purpose because I knew nothing about guns and I didn't want to be part of it. I went to work as usual.
You left the metal in the house?
No, I had it in the car, still folded in tissue paper. I got the car from the day driver and confirmed that it was there at around 3 a.m. I took the metal and went home with it. The guy called me again and asked me if I had seen the metal, and I told him I didn't find it.
Before we proceed, news of the MP's death had spread.
Yes, MP Muchai and his bodyguards had been killed, and that was in my mind because of what I had seen. I worked, and when I got home, I told my wife I was afraid of how things would go, because if those people were arrested, maybe they would talk about me. I told her I was thinking of talking to a friend of mine who was an officer commanding station, OCS, at Kabete, and I did that the next day. I called him and told him the story and told him I had that piece of metal, and he asked me if we could meet in Kasarani. I carried that metal, and when we met, I told him the whole story and I gave him that metallic piece. He asked me if I knew what that was, and then he told me that that was a safety pin used for G3 and AK-47 rifles, and the smell was because of the gunpowder. He took me to the flying squad, and I found they were already in the boardroom. After all that, Ndego Muhoro, then DCI boss, came into the room and gave me 20,000 shillings and asked me to go and stay at home and they would call me. We went in 2 cars with the police officers. I showed them where I waited and where he had gone into, and after going through the path, they noticed that one of the number was still in that location. They said they would not act at the time. 1 car brought me back to town and I went home. The following day, I was called and told all the guys had been arrested. We need you here. Those officers asked if I was the one who carried them. They said I was the one who carried them. Then they asked who made the call, and the client said he called me and he knew me because I usually carry him. Then the officer asked me if I'm the one who carried them, and I said yes. The officer told me that is all I had to do. The officer gave me 3,000 shillings and asked me to get a taxi to home and stay there until they called me. I didn't go to work since that day, but after some time I started wondering. So I realized that since those guys had no idea I was the one who had reported them, I would just go back to work. I went back to work, and halfway through the 2nd month, I got a call. Hey, where are you? I'm at work.
Who called you?
It's the guy, the client. He asked me how is it that I was out, and I told him that I gave part of my story and I was released on bond. He told me that I was now a threat to them and they wanted me to leave that area. I asked them where was I to go, yet that's where I was raised and it's all I knew. He told me it is better for me to move away because if I was arrested, there would be only one way for me. I told him I would think about it, and he told me there was nothing to think about and I had to move. So I told him I will move away. After cutting off communication, I called the officer and told him that those guys had called me and asked me to leave the place I worked because they didn't want to see me in court. The officer told me not to worry, there was nothing they could do and I would not be needed to go to court. He said I was good to go on with my job, and I did, but he told me to change my phone number if possible. But changing my phone number would mean losing my customers, and he asked me if my customers were more important than my life. And he told me that my customers knew me and they would find me one way or another. So I changed my number. But after about 2 weeks, cars that were of the same model as the car I was working with were being targeted. The first car was hijacked and they did not steal anything from the driver except for his phone. The second one was a similar case, and the third one, the guy who used to take the day shifts was involved. Sometimes he would have a different car, but he used the one I had mostly. The guy was hijacked, although he had a different car, it was the same model. We had a similar name, Njuguna. The car was found about 4 days after he was hijacked, and he was found after 2 weeks. Taxi driver started searching for him when he was not found, and finally we found him in a mortuary in Ukambani. He had been strangled with a wire. I added things up and realized probably they were looking for me. They went for the body, and after the funeral, I had a call from the officer and he told me to go to Anti-Terrorism Police Unit, ATPU, office where he had moved to from the flying squad. I went there and he told me he had heard what had happened, and that was part of life. I asked him. He said I was fortunate to be alive. Then he told me about the guys from the Witness Protection Program who wanted me to go and testify, but I told him I did not sign their documents because I had not been informed about testifying. So he told me they wanted to move me far from Nairobi, and he asked me where I would want to move to, but within Kenya. He asked if I would want to go to Mombasa, Kilifi. I told him all that was okay as long as I would be able to work, and agreed on Kilifi. He told me they would coordinate with the Witness Protection Program to support me because I need to pay rent and have food when I move. I asked him about immigration and he told me that that would be processed. But for the moment, he told me they would come with a lawyer who would explain everything to me. But all I had to do was to sign the documents so they would release money for my protection. After signing the documents, I was accompanied home by a police officer and they told me they wanted me to stay there for 4 to 5 days as they searched for a house for me. I agreed, and after 4 days, I was called and told the officer who had accompanied me was coming to get me. He came and they got me and my wife and took me to Kilifi, where we were placed in a hotel for a week, just eating and sleeping. After a week, they furnished the house and we moved in, and I was told that's where I would live. From then, under a different identity, but I would have to testify.
lakini ujue sasa lazima utestify kwa sababu ukitestify wewe utakuwa umetoka Kenya.